Chapter 1. The Whispering Lampshade. The morning sun slanted through the lace-curtained windows of Whisperwood Manor, casting delicate patterns upon the polished oak floorboards. Outside the village of St. Mary's under Cliff was abuzz with anticipation. Today was the much-anticipated Midsummer Garden Fete, a tradition dating back nearly a century, and Mrs. Violet Price's famed tea tent had become the event's crowning glory. Rows of trestle tables draped in embroidered cloths snaked through the rose-bordered lawn, each promising a selection of freshly baked scones, lemon tarts, and the Earl Grey blend that had earned Mrs. Price a devoted following. Miss Marple, seated discreetly beneath a pear tree on the lawn's fringe, observed the scene with her customary quiet interest. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she coaxed a stitch into place, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. The elderly vicar, Canon Harrington, fussed over the display of homemade jams. Mrs. Everleigh, the postmistress, whispered animatedly to her husband about the new school teacher. Even Colonel Mustard, recently retired from the army and still in his prim uniform, adjusted his bowler hat with an inelegant flourish. All seemed idyllic, yet Miss Marple noted tiny signs of tension. A too firm smile here, a glance a fraction too sharp there. Children darted between the tables, their laughter a high, cheerful counterpoint to the more subdued chatter of their elders. Pale bunting fluttered from trellises, and a string quartet tuned its violins beside a magnolia tree. Everything was exactly as it should be until Mrs. Price herself, resplendent in a rose-pink summer dress, beckoned the entire assembly to "Attention, ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice bright. "Welcome to our 19th annual fete. I trust you will enjoy the teas, the games, and the auction. Oh, and don't forget the raffle. All proceeds this year go to St. Mary's Children's Fund." Applause rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Price swept a curtsy that must have taken months of practice. She moved toward the central marquee, where a porcelain bust of Queen Victoria presided over a selection of prize-worthy baked goods. Miss Marple continued to watch, noting how several villagers shifted uneasily whenever Mrs. Price drew near dot at precisely 10 o'clock. The vicar lifted his hand. "Let us begin with a blessing," he intoned. Heads bowed politely, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting gaze between two women, Mrs. Price and her long-time rival, Mrs. Pemberton of Ivy Cottage, each eyeing the other as though sizing up an opponent before a duel. The crowd, however, remained oblivious, and the vicar's words drifted past them. When the blessing ended, Mrs. Price raised her hand again. "Now, my dears, would someone kindly lift the lampshade from the parlor exhibit? It's said to whisper at night, and I do so want to prove it's nothing more than a silly superstition." A hush fell, and a young man, Mr. Giles, the local carpenter, stepped forward to tug at the corner of the draped cloth. The crowd leaned in, and even Miss Marple's knitting paused. The lampshade, an elegant piece of rosy silk embroidered with trailing ivy, glimmered into view atop a small table. Its curious shape and delicate fringe gave it an almost human silhouette. "That's it," Mrs. Price exclaimed. "See how the silk catches the breeze? Some say they hear voices when the air moves through those fringes. I dare you to try, Mr. Giles." Mr. Giles, cheeks reddening, tapped the shade lightly with a slender finger. He drew back abruptly, as though the touch had stung him. The hush deepened further, charged now with curiosity and a tinge of apprehension. "Did you hear anything?" someone called. "Just the fabric rustling," Mr. Giles mumbled. Encouraged, Mrs. Price stepped forward. She lifted the shade an inch off its stand, whispering, "I'll wager there's no whisper here, but my own heart beating." She allowed it to drop, and a faint crack echoed from within. A collective gasp rose as the lampshade swung slightly, and beneath it, half hidden, in its shadow lay a small, dark object. Mrs. Price's gasp turned to shrill alarm. "Oh, heavens! What is that?" The vicar hurried forward. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting aside. The crowd pressed in, a dozen faces frozen in shock. Under the lampshade lay the diamond brooch Mrs. Price had intended to raffle for charity, a virtually priceless heirloom, said to have belonged to her great-grandmother. Mrs. Price's hand flew to her mouth as Colonel Mustard bent to retrieve the brooch. His fingers trembled. As he straightened, the villagers leaned in to see, but Mrs. Price's relief at finding the brooch was short-lived. The object beside it, hardly visible at first, became horrifyingly clear, a small vial. Its contents a dark crimson liquid. "It's blood," whispered Mrs. Pemberton. White-knuckled Dot. Mrs. Price's eyes darted around the gathering, perplexed. But whose? And how did? Before she could finish, the vicar cried out, stepping back and staring at the carpet inside the marquee. A spreading stain, dark and growing, marked the edge of the cloth. Someone screamed. A woman collapsed to her knees, wailing. Miss Marple moved swiftly, pushing through the startled villagers. Inside the marquee, she found Mrs. Everleigh crouched beside a reclining figure. Mr. Roland Finch, the school teacher, lay utterly still, a deep wound at his temple. The veil lay shattered at his feet, its crimson contents seeping into the grass. A hush unlike any before descended, broken only by the distant strains of the quartet, now playing in uneasy, dissonant notes. Mrs. Price clutched her brooch, tears in her eyes. Canon Harrington bent to check Finch's pulse, but Miss Marple, with gentle firmness, placed her hand on his shoulder. "He's gone," she said softly. The words rippled through the crowd like stones tossed into a pond. St. Mary's. Undercliff had never seen such violence. Villagers clustered together, voices hushed in speculation. But Miss Marple, scanning every face, had already begun to piece together the incongruities. The rivalry between Mrs. Price and Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Giles's startled withdrawal, the vicar's frantic distraction, each a thread in a tangled web. As the quartet's halting melody faded, Miss Marple knelt to examine the broken vial. The label now smeared bore the faintest hint of a red ink monogram. R.F. She smoothed the grass around it, noting one tiny footprint in the damp earth. A child's? A woman's? Rising, she cleared her throat gently. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, voice calm but carrying across the marquee. "I believe we have more questions than answers. But before the police arrive, might I ask that no one leave the grounds? The murderer is among us." A shiver passed through the assembly. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her handbag, then lifted her gaze to the wavering crowd. The fete, meant to be a celebration of summer's warmth, had transformed in an instant into a crime scene, and at its very heart sat the silent whisper of a lampshade, and the deadly secret it revealed. Chapter 2. The village reacts. News of the school teacher's death spread through St. Mary's Undercliff like wildfire. within moments of Miss Marple's firm request that no one leave the grounds. Groups of villagers clustered at the edge of the marquee, voices pitched low in speculative chatter. The string quartet, having abandoned its bowed instruments in confusion, drifted toward the rose border, leading half-hearted harmonies. Mrs. Price, pale and trembling, stood beside Canon Harrington, gripping his arm as though the vicar's stole could somehow protect her beloved fate from ruin. Who could have done such a thing? Sobbed Mrs. Price, her rose-pink gown now stained with dew and terror. It's unthinkable, murmured Mrs. Pemberton, voice tight. She avoided Mrs. Price's gaze, though Miss Marple noted the flicker of triumph behind her teary eyes. Roland was so gentle, so kind to the children. Children pressed against the ropes laid around the marquee, faces wide with confusion. Lillian, the vicar's granddaughter, whispered to her brother, "Do you think he really died?" Her brother shrugged, unsure whether tears or laughter was the appropriate response to this astonishing breach of safety in their small world. Inspector Harold Baker arrived then, his polished boots leaving muddy tracks on the manicured lawn. He was a sturdy man in his late 40s, spectacles perched low on his nose, eyes keen under thick brows. He strode to the center of the marquee, hat in hand, and addressed the crowd with the professional calm of a man trained to restore order. "May I have your attention, please? My name is Inspector Baker of the County Constabulary. I shall require statements from all present. In the meantime, I ask you remain calm and quiet. This is now a crime scene." Several villagers cleared their throats and forced their way closer, eager to demonstrate their reverence for law and order. Others shrank back, clutching parasols like shields. Mrs. Everleigh, still kneeling beside the limp form of Mr. Finch, wiped tears from her eyes as Canon Harrington intoned a prayer for the departed. Miss Marple watched Baker survey the scene. The overturned trestle table, strewn with teacups, the shattered vial with its smeared monogram, the diamond brooch resting innocently beside the dead man's outstretched hand. Even Inspector Baker paused, brow furrowing as he bent to inspect the brooch, then the vial's label. "R.F.," he murmured, reading the blurred letters. Roland Finch's initials, perhaps? His own blood? Or simply a cruel irony? He straightened and looked at the crowd. "I shall begin by asking a few questions of Mrs. Price. Then I will speak to those who discovered the body. Afterward, everyone here will have a turn." A murmur of assent rippled through the assembly. Mrs. Price, still clutching her brooch, allowed herself to bend gently aside. Miss Marple, stepping forward, offered Baker her knitting bag. "If you need anything, pen, paper, tea," she said, voice soft. "I'm at your disposal." Baker nodded curtly. "Thank you, Miss Marple, Jane Marple." He studied her for a moment. "Ah, of course. Your reputation precedes you." Miss Marple only smiled, though her mind raced. Baker turned to Mrs. Price and, with all civilian politeness, offered her a handkerchief. Mrs. Price accepted it with a grateful sniffle dot as Baker interviewed Mrs. Price. A swirl of gossip enveloped Miss Marple. Mrs. Pemberton leaned close, whispering of Mrs. Price's rumored debts, of her frantic need for charity funds. Mr. Giles stared at his own trembling hands, muttering that he had merely touched the lampshade and found the brooch by accident. Colonel Mustard, his bowler, had forgotten. recounted loudly how he had seen a dark figure slip away behind the orchard hedges as Mrs. Price drew back the linen cover. "I thought it was just the gardener," Colonel Mustard insisted. "But when I turned, there was no one. Strange, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, storing each fragment. The gardener, young Tom Whitaker, stood quietly apart, cap in hand, not meeting anyone's eye. His cheeks were pale, and his shirt bore a faint smear near the shoulder. When Miss Marple glanced in his direction, he looked away, as though ashamed of something unseen. Inspector Baker finished with Mrs. Price and began speaking to Canon Harrington, who recounted his actions. At the moment of the blessing, the vicar's narrative was impeccable. He had raised his hand, spoken the words, then noticed Mrs. Price's alarm. Yet Miss Marple caught the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, an unspoken thought that all was not as he'd first described. Meanwhile, Mrs. Everleigh, the postmistress, stood to relay how she had discovered Finch's body. She insisted the teacher had preceded her into the marquee, having asked to examine the unusual lampshade. She heard a crack, saw Finch stagger, then found him sprawled on the floor. In her trembling voice, she insisted she'd done all she could. But for Miss Marple's quiet intervention, there might have been a scene of real tragedy. As Baker moved down the line of witnesses, Miss Marple engaged Tom Whitaker with gentle questions. "Tell me, Tom, had you any quarrel with Mr. Finch of late?" The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. He was kind. He even showed me some of the essays the children wrote. And the smear on your shirt?" Miss Marple touched her chin thoughtfully. "That looks like what was on the ground near the body." Tom glanced at the smear. "Mud, I think, from fixing the trestle legs over there," he said, pointing to a distant support. "I slipped." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Mud slips everywhere, don't they?" Her voice was gentle, but her eyes held a question. The boy gave a small nod and shuffled away. By the time Inspector Baker reached the end of the row, Miss Marple had assembled a mental map. The jealous rival, the frightened carpenter, the confused gardener, the grief-stricken postmistress. But one face she had yet to question was that of Mrs. Pemberton, who drifted now by itself, eyes darting between Mrs. Price and Mr. Giles, as though seeking confirmation of each whispered theory. And Colonel Mustard, with his military bearing, still stood guard by the rose border, his uniform unflappable in contrast to his obvious agitation. When Baker paused for a breath, Miss Marple stepped beside him. "Inspector, might I suggest you speak with Mrs. Pemberton next?" She seemed very keen to see Mrs. Price's distress. "And why is that, Miss Marple?" Baker asked, arching an eyebrow. Miss Marple tapped the ground with her heel, indicating the tiny footprint by the lampshade. "This little mark suggests someone of slight build knelt close to the shade. Mrs. Pemberton is slight, yes? And I noticed she lingered near the display when everyone else was distracted by the blessing." Baker crouched to inspect the print. "Remarkably small," he said, "but I shall want to question her whenever I can." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Whenever you're ready." Baker rose and proceeded to Mrs. Pemberton, who straightened, smoothing her gloves. Miss Marple returned to the marquis's entrance and observed in silence as Baker began his next inquiry. Beyond the ropes, the village braced itself. The garden fete, that emblem of summer gaiety, was suspended in a hall of mirrors, where every reflection suggested hidden depths, and every whispered comment dared to reveal a secret. Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her mind, though not in her hands, felt the threads of motive weaving into a tapestry. When the inspector finally caught her eye, Miss Marple tipped her head slightly, as though to say, "I'm watching, Inspector, and I believe the answer is closer than you think." As the clouds drifted across the sun and a soft breeze set the bunting fluttering once more, the village held its breath. Somewhere in that swirl of gossip, fear, and whispered resentment lay the truth, and Miss Marple intended to follow each strand until the murderer stood revealed. Chapter 3. Early investigation. Miss Marple returned her gaze to the fallen trestle table and the shattered veil as Inspector Baker turned his attention to Mrs. Pemberton's trembling hands. The postmistress, once composed, now wrung her lace-edged handkerchief, her face as pale as the sifted flour on Mrs. Price's cake stands. With the crowd held at bay and the constabulary establishing order, the time had come for more discreet inquiries, quiet observations that would reveal what mere questioning might obscure. First, she approached Mrs. Everleigh, who lingered beneath the marquee's canopy, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the spot where Mr. Finch had fallen. The postmistress looked as though she might repeat her story at length. Miss Marple gently intercepted her. "Mrs. Everleigh," she said softly, "you have a keen memory for detail. Would you mind telling me again exactly what you saw when you entered here?" Mrs. Everleigh blinked, then stepped closer so that none but Miss Marple could hear. "I heard a soft groan," she began, voice quivering. "I thought it was the lampshade's silk, but then the sound turned harsh a cry. I hurried in, and there he lay. I froze at first, then knelt to help. But the vial was already broken, and," she swallowed, "I saw the brooch. It lay still gleaming, unmoved." Miss Marple nodded, folding a piece of parchment from her reticule to press into the postmistress's hand. "Thank you. You did very well." As Mrs. Everleigh drifted away, clutching the note like a talisman, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the display table itself. Teacups lay in disarray, petals of crushed roses dotted the linen, and the lampshade, once the star attraction, now hung limp, its fringe matted. She knelt, smoothing the tablecloth with careful fingers so lightly as not to disturb any latent print. Then she straightened and examined the lampshade's silk. At the hem, almost imperceptible, were two tiny threads, one red, one green, that did not belong to the embroidery. "Strange," Miss Marple murmured, tucking the threads into a folded corner of the cloth. A quick glance revealed the brooch's pin bent, as though pried open with deliberate care. Whoever hid the brooch beneath the shade had taken pains to ensure it would not slip free too soon. Yet the pin's distortion suggested haste, not finesse. Moments later, Inspector Baker gestured politely. "Miss Marple, might you join me for a word?" She rose, smoothing her skirt and resuming her knitting, though her needles only tapped an occasional stitch, her thoughts too busy to form any pattern. "I've heard rumors, Miss Marple, of your insights. If you have any observations, do share them. Anything might help." Miss Marple studied the inspector's earnest face. "Thank you, Inspector. I have noticed a few peculiarities. First, the bent pin on the brooch. Its owner, or a thief, was neither expert nor calm. Second, these threads," she held out the red and green strands, "suggest the perpetrator brushed against foliage or another fabric before and after concealing the brooch here, Baker took the threads, peering at them thoughtfully. Red and green. But whose garments are we missing? The only person in those colors was Mrs. Price in her pink, though her dress was rose, not red or green. Precisely, said Miss Marple. And yet, does any other villager here wear such hues? Mrs. Pemberton, perhaps emerald gloves, a scarlet scarf. She lingers nearby, with gloves that match neither thread. But someone may have removed an accessory before or after the deed. Baker nodded. I shall note that. Do you think Mrs. Pemberton might have slipped away, removed a scarf or cloak, then returned? It is possible, Miss Marple agreed. But let us not overlook the gardener, Tom Whitaker. His shirt bore a smear, perhaps blood, perhaps mud. Yet he was the last I saw near this marquee before the blessing. The inspector frowned. He maintains it was mud from repairing the table legs. Miss Marple tilted her head. A plausible explanation, but it does not account for why he looked so startled when Mr. Giles touched the shade. Did you question Mr. Giles again? I did, though I must admit his account was rather limp. He said he merely tapped the shade and jumped back in surprise, which suggests he felt something unexpected, perhaps the brooch brushing his finger. But the crux remains. How did the victim, Mr. Finch, come to be murdered here? His body shows a wound at the temple, single and clean. The weapon, however, is missing. Baker's expression darkened. Yes, no weapon. If the vial contained blood, the killer could have used it to stage a scene of faux poisoning. But the wound suggests a blow from an object harder than glass. Miss Marple considered the overturned cups once more. A heavy candlestick, perhaps, or one of these. Ceramic pots. Let us walk through the steps. Mr. Finch comes here to examine the lampshade. He hears Thelegand, leans close. The killer strikes him quickly, perhaps with something to hand, then conceals the brooch beneath the shade and smashes the vial to suggest a curse or poisoning. It reads like theatrics, Baker said, but the killer might want to distract. Use with a superstition to cover up a more personal motive. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, and superstition can wound the mind more deeply than any blow. I think it would help to speak with Colonel Mustard. Again, his military training might have made him notice something about timing or angles that the rest of us missed. Baker consulted his notebook. He said he saw a silhouette moving behind the hedge at the very moment of the blessing. Yet he did not know it was the killer until much later. Encourage him to recall the exact moment. The blessing was at 10 o'clock sharp. Could he pinpoint which phrase he heard when he looked away? If he heard the final amen as he turned, the murderer must have struck just after. The inspector nodded. Very well. And do you wish to speak to Mrs. Pemberton again? Miss Marple glanced at the distant rows of bunting, rippling in the breeze like question marks. Yes, but quietly. Let us not alarm her. We shall present our curiosity as innocent interest in her gloves and scarf. Mention the threads. Await her reaction. Inspector Baker gave a brief salute, resolute. I will do exactly that. As he strode off to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple lingered by the lampshade. The fragrance of crushed rose and spilled tea lingered in the air, a poignant reminder of how quickly beauty can give way to violence. She reached into her handbag and retrieved a small notebook. In tidy script, she jotted, brooch pin bent, hurried removal threads, red and green possible scarf, cloak smear on Tom's shirt. Blood or mud? Colonel. Silhouette behind hedge at Amon Misses. Pemberton. Gloves, emerald, scarf scarlet. She closed the notebook and tucked it away. Above her, the clouds parted to let a shaft of sunlight illuminate the marquee's fringe, and the shattered lampshade seemed to whisper still. Miss Marple rose and turned toward the rose garden, knowing that each whisper in St. Mary's under cliff carried a secret, and only by gathering those secrets, piece by piece, could she weave together the true story behind the fatal strike, a story that was far from the legend of a whispering lampshade. Chapter 3. A web of suspicions. Miss Marple watched Inspector. Baker crossed the lawn toward Mrs. Pemberton, her emerald gloves folded neatly in his notebook as he began his questioning. She remained beneath the marquee's fringe, fingertips brushing the scattered rose petals, her mind tracing the subtle threads that connected each person to the crime. The fate's charm had curdled into suspicion, and every polite smile now carried the weight of hidden intent. She beckoned Tom Whitaker, the young gardener, to her side. His cheeks were flushed, his cap clutched in both hands. "Tom," Miss Marple said softly, "would you mind telling me again about the trestle legs? You said you slipped. Might we look at the exact spot?" Tom nodded and led her to the north side of the marquee, where the legs rested on uneven ground. The earth here was damp, hoof-print-shaped indentations beside staked ropes. Miss Marple knelt, her skirts brushing the grass, and examined a fresh smear of dark soil on the base of one leg. "See here," she murmured. "This soil matches the patch on your shirt near the shoulder." Tom swallowed. I leaned to tighten the rope, and my elbow dipped into the clay. "I didn't notice until later." Miss Marple straightened. "Thank you, Tom. You did well to tell me. Now, do you recall exactly when you bent to adjust that rope before or after the blessing?" He hesitated, eyes downcast. "Before, ma'am. I was only trying to help." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "We must account for every moment." She patted his shoulder gently, then stepped back to survey the marquee. Tom moved away, relief and uncertainty warring on his face. Meanwhile, Inspector Baker paused his questioning of Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Marple saw the woman's breath catch as he mentioned the threads found on the lampshade, red and green. Mrs. Pemberton's gloved hand went to her scarf, which she promptly smoothed into place as though hiding something. Miss Marple approached them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton," she said with innocent cordiality. "Might I look at your scarf? I'm curious whether these threads, red and green, match any material here." She produced the tiny fragments pinned between two folds of her handkerchief. Mrs. Pemberton's lips thinned. She unwound her scarf, revealing a subtly patterned silk of burgundy and olive. "It's my late sister's," she said in clipped tones. "See how the colors were meant to intertwine." She allowed the scarf to fall loose, but the silver tassels at each end caught the sunlight, shimmering like watchful eyes. Miss Marple inclined her head. "A lovely piece. Thank you." She made no accusation, but her gaze lingered on the frayed edge of the scarf where the burgundy thread had begun to unweave. "Interesting," she murmured. "These tassels might brush the table if one leans over." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes darted to the marquee's lintel. "I must check on my gloves," she said, slipping away before more could be asked. As Mrs. Pemberton departed, Colonel Mustard joined Miss Marple. his bowler hat forgotten on the grass. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low, "I cannot shake the memory of that figure behind the hedges. It was slender more like your gardener than any matron here." Miss Marple nodded. "You saw it at the final word of the blessing?" He blinked. "Yes, Amon, precisely. I turned to look, expecting only the hedgerow. Instead, a glimpse of a dark coat-no hat slipping away. I thought perhaps it was Giles or Whitaker returning to work. I did not imagine a killer." "Miss," Marple tapped her knitting bag, "but someone intended us to think superstition caused the death. The broken vial of curse blood was theater. The real motive lies elsewhere, in human motives." He frowned. "You suspect the brooch?" "Only that it was placed deliberately to distract. The killer's true aim was Finch." She paused. "Tell me, did Mr. Finch carry any personal items? A watch, perhaps?" "Anything missing?" Colonel Mustard considered. "Just his school satchel, but that was slung across his shoulder. The watch, yes, he wore a gold fob watch, which is gone now." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A message, perhaps. A stolen watch could serve to delay discovery or provide a false trail." They returned to the marquee entrance where Canon Harrington addressed Inspector Baker in earnest tones. Miss Marple slipped in between them. "Canon," she said, "you mentioned seeing Mrs. Price's distress first. Might you recall whether she seemed more agitated by the broken vial or the discovery of poor Mr. Finch?" The vicar wiped his spectacles. "It was the man, certainly, but when she saw the vial well, she recoiled as though something more than blood lay within." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Emotional theater can mask true reactions. Thank you." We. Inspector joined them. "I'll take the cannon next, then circle back to Baker's men for a formal sweep." He produced a small pad. "Miss Marple, your insights are helpful. I intend to keep you close." Miss Marple inclined her head, but said nothing. From the corner of her eye she noted Mr. Giles approaching, ashen-faced and carrying his toolbox. "Inspector." Baker intercepted Giles. "Mr. Giles, we need you for a moment." Giles looked from Miss Marple to Baker and gave a slight nod. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag. "I believe it's time for tea," she declared, lifting a cup from the small refreshment table. Even here the silver teapot glinted with an irony that did not escape her. She poured herself a cup, inhaled the fragrant steam, and sipped deliberately. The villagers watched, some with envy at her calm composure, others with suspicion that she drank while their friend's blood still stained the grass dot as the inspector led Mr. Giles away. Miss Marple remained still, her knitting needles finely moving in quiet rhythm. The air grew heavy with the scent of roses and damp earth. Overhead, the bannered bunting fluttered as though whispering secrets of its own got in that moment. Miss Marple's mind wove disparate details into a tentative tapestry. The guilty hand would be the one, most adept at concealing guilt beneath innocence. Mrs. Pemberton's frayed scarf, the gardener's uncertain alibi, Colonel Mustard's fleeting silhouette, and the missing watch all pointed toward a plan more intimate than mere theft of charity funds, and Mr. Finch's gentle nature suggested. His killer had motive far removed from random violence. As she finished her tea, she rose and placed her empty cup on the saucer. The inspector returned with Mr. Giles, and a hush fell as she approached. "Inspector," she said, voice soft but carrying, Might I suggest you examine Mr. Finch's satchel? A broken clasp could tell us if it was opened in haste or not at all." Baker blinked, surprised. "I had not thought of that." He glanced at Giles, then nodded. "Good idea. Let us do so." Miss Marple stepped back, folding her hands. The villagers watched with bated breath as Baker motioned for 2 constables to retrieve the satchel. The case lay poised to open, like the petals of a flower reluctant to reveal its stamen dot, and in that pregnant silence, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, private smile. Every question asked, every object moved, brought her closer to the truth. The lampshade still whispered its legend, but Miss Marple listened instead to the murmur of motives in St. Mary's, under cliff, knowing that only when the satchel was opened would the murderer's identity come fully into focus. Chapter 4. First, Suspects Inspector Baker closed Mr. Finch's satchel with gloved hands and motioned the constables to stand by. These satchel's once neat straps now lay frayed, as though someone had wrenched it open in haste. Miss Marple observed the gathering crowd, strained faces pressed against the crime scene ropes, each villager fighting to appear composed while inwardly imagining themselves accused. Baker addressed the knotted assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 items missing from Mr. Finch's satchel, his gold fob watch and his notebook. I intend to question those nearest when it fell open." He glanced at Colonel Mustard, who stiffened. "Colonel, you stood closest on the east side." The retired officer swallowed. I did, sir." His gaze flicked to Miss Marple before returning to the inspector. "But I saw nothing but the vial and the brooch." Baker narrowed his eyes. "And yet, Colonel, you saw a figure behind the hedge at exactly 10 o'clock. If that figure removed the watch, we must consider you a witness to a theft as well as a murder." The colonel's shoulders sagged under the weight of accusation. Miss Marple stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the colonel's arm. "Do not be dismayed, Colonel. You have provided vital information about timing. But let us not leap to conclusions." She turned to Baker. "Perhaps the watch was taken by someone who disguised themselves as the figure behind the hedge, using the blessing as cover." Inspector Baker gave her a grateful nod. "Miss Marple, your counsel is appreciated." He motioned to Mrs. Pemberton, who hovered at the Marquis's side. "Mrs. Pemberton, you were near the display when it began. Where were you immediately after the blessing?" The postmistress smoothed her burgundy skirt. "I stepped aside, frankly, to catch my breath. The excitement of the brooch's discovery startled me. I did not see Mr. Finch's satchel fall. Yet, your scarf was found to have threads matching those on the lampshade." Baker's voice was firm. "Did you brush against the table when you stepped back?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes flashed. "Inspector, I did not touch the exhibit. I confess, my scarf trailed behind me, but I recoiled like everyone else when the vial shattered." She lifted her chin. "I would never harm poor Mr. Finch." Miss Marple noticed her gloves tremble, despite the brave tone. "Mrs. Pemberton," she interjected softly, "even a recoil might leave a thread. But whether those threads came from you or someone framing you is another matter." Baker consulted his notes. "I will need your glove linings examined. But next, Mr. Giles." He waved to the carpenter, who approached carrying his toolbox with an unsteady step. Giles looked from the inspector to Miss Marple. "Sir?" "Mr. "Giles," Baker said, "you discovered the lampshade and touched it. You said you jumped back in surprise. What were you expecting to find?" Giles cleared his throat. I heard something rustle inside. I thought perhaps a bird or a mouse had nested there. When I tapped lightly, the brooch fell out and I nearly dropped the shade." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry if I made things worse." "Inspector." Baker pressed on. "And yet you claim you saw nothing of the body when you approached?" Giles shook his head. "No, sir. I only saw the cloth, then the brooch. I did not realize Mr. Finch was lying just beyond." Miss Marple frowned. "But, from the vantage you described leaning over the table, you must have been almost on top of him. A groan might have warned you." Giles blinked. "He didn't move. I thought he was hidden behind the tablecloth." Baker tapped his pen against his palm. "Have you any reason to approach that table later? Perhaps to hide something?" Giles's lips quivered. "No, sir. I repaired a broken slat on the stand afterward, but that was after they'd sealed the area." He pointed to the distant corner. Constable Peters took notes. Miss Marple noted the distance between Giles's repair spot and the lampshade. It was enough to avoid traces of blood on his tools if he had chosen to hide them there. But she also observed Giles's genuine distress. She believed he spoke truthfully about the shade, though she remained unconvinced it was mere happenstance. Inspector Baker sighed and moved on. Colonel Mustard a moment more. "You mentioned you saw a figure slip behind the hedge. Did you notice? Any weapon, a stick perhaps, or a gardening implement?" The colonel clenched his fists. "It was too dark behind the ivy. I only saw a shape turning swiftly, a man's build, lean, moving with purpose. No hat, no tool in hand." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did you return to that spot after the blessing?" Colonel Mustard hesitated. "Yes, I circled back when I heard Mrs. Price's cry. There was nothing there but footprints in the damp soil." She smiled serenely. "Footprints are clues, Colonel. You saw the figure brush past, yet no mention of the footprint's direction." She glanced at the ground. Someone trod lightly on the grass outside the roped-off area. Baker bent to inspect a faint footprint, delicate, size 6, and shallow as though the wearer tiptoed. Miss Marple knelt beside him. "Likely a woman, or someone slender. Mrs. Pemberton's slight frame matches, but so does Mrs. Price's niece, Miss Harrington." The inspector looked up. "Miss Harrington? She's been quiet. Where is she now?" Miss Marple pointed to the edge of the crowd where Lillian Harrington, the vicar's granddaughter, stood clutching a handkerchief. She seemed overcome by events, but her eyes were bright with morbid fascination. "Lillian," called Miss Marple gently, approaching her. "Might I speak with you? You slipped away briefly after the blessing." The girl trembled, but nodded, her auburn curls trembling. I felt ill, but then I heard a scream." Miss Marple took her hand. "Did you see anyone nearby?" Lillian swallowed. "I saw Mrs. Price and Mrs. Pemberton arguing quietly over the raffle tickets, I think. But then I turned and saw the gardener was gone, and Mr. Giles was kneeling by the shade." Miss Marple drew in a breath. "And the person behind the hedge, did you glimpse them?" Lillian looked down. "I thought it was a child, a young woman, wearing a green shawl. I ran toward them, but they slipped away into the orchard." a green shawl that echoed the thread Miss Marple found. She glanced at Mrs. Pemberton's olive accents on her scarf. But Miss Marple also recalled Mrs. Price's own shawl, worn earlier at the church, left in the vicarage by mistake. Could it have been the niece? Inspector Baker, hearing the exchange, approached. "Miss Marple, can you confirm this?" He turned to Lillian. "Young lady, did you see a green shawl at the edge of the orchard?" Lillian nodded. Yes, it fluttered among the apple trees. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Lillian. You have been brave." The inspector turned to Mrs. Price, who had been hovering nearby in shock. "Mrs. Price, did you miss a shawl earlier?" Mrs. Price blinked. "Yes, my niece left her green shawl on a pew at church. I offered to return it, but Lillian said she would fetch it later. I thought she wore it back here." "Then you believe Miss Harrington possessed a green shawl," Baker summed up. He glanced to Miss Marple. "What are your thoughts?" Miss Marple folded her hands. The threads were red and green, but the shawl's green does not match the shade too coarse. And Lillian, being young, would not tiptoe behind a hedge. I suspect someone framed her to distract us. Baker frowned. By planting threads or misdirection. Exactly, said Miss Marple. Our first suspects have been questioned, yet each story contains inconsistencies meant to confuse. We must focus now on forensic clarity. Examine the watch's chain for marks, test the cloth threads for dye, and retrace the silhouette's path. Inspector Baker closed his notebook. We shall do so. Miss Marple, your guidance is invaluable. She inclined her head, watching as the inspector dispatched constables to carry out her suggestions. The villagers murmured among themselves, unsettled by the shift in focus from broad suspicion to precise inquiry. In that moment, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, confident smile. The killer's web of deception was beginning to unravel, one carefully chosen thread at a time. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the orchard's apple boughs, painting dappled patterns on the grass as Inspector Baker's constables fanned out to retrace the silhouette's path. Miss Marple remained by the marquee, her sharp eyes drifting over each detail. The damp footprint still faintly impressed near the rope stake, the overturned teacup on the refreshment table, and, most curiously, a single white glove lying half-hidden among crushed rose petals. She picked it up with gloved fingers, noting the delicate stitchwork along the cuff. Not Mrs. Pemberton's embroidery, nor Mrs. Price's finer lace. This glove was smaller, plainer, a maid's glove. Yet no servant had been invited to the fete. Miss Marple slipped the glove into a paper bag held by Constable Peters and tucked the threads she had found earlier into her pocket. Inspector Baker approached, his expression thoughtful. "You found something, Miss Marple?" "A glove," she said, handing him the bag. "Size small, likely left by someone bending close to the marquee. I believe it fell when they retrieved or planted the brooch." Baker peered into the bag. "Remarkable. I'll have it dusted for prints." Miss Marple nodded. "Meanwhile, might we examine the brooch's pin more closely? Its bend suggests it was pried open with a small tool, perhaps from your carpenter's kit." She glanced toward Mr. Giles, standing apart with his toolbox under his arm. Baker frowned. "I'll speak to him again. But first, the glove. A new suspect entirely. As the inspector summoned Peters and another constable, Miss Marple drifted toward the rose garden, where Mrs. Price wept beside one of her prize blooms. The woman's composure had all but shattered, now that suspicion extended beyond the original. Phew. Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. "Mrs. Price, I know this is difficult, but have you noticed anyone acting strangely since the murder?" Mrs. Price dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Everyone seems terrified. Even Colonel Mustard scarcely spoke after you suggested he witnessed the figure." Miss Marple lowered her voice. "Sometimes one reaction hides another. May I look at your rose? I wonder if any fallen petals bear clue." Mrs. Price followed her to the bloom. Miss Marple knelt and carefully lifted petals, examining their undersides for discoloration. The rose itself was pristine, but on a damp leaf at its base lay a small scrap of paper cream colored, torn unevenly. She plucked it up and unfolded. It, in elegant script, barely legible beneath a smudge of mud, were 2 words: "Forgive me." "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Price. "What could that mean?" Miss Marple smoothed the paper. "It suggests remorse, either genuine or contrived. But placed here, it had to be noticed only by someone moving among the flowers." She handed the note to Mrs. Price. "Keep it safe, please." Then to Baker. "An unsigned confession, perhaps? Or a red herring?" Baker studied the scrap. "Who writes like that?" "Not Mr. Finch. His handwriting was block letters, and none of the villagers speak in such poetic tones." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Lillian Harrington, standing at a distance, clutching her green shawl. The girl's eyes were fixed on the note, her face pale. Unexpectedly, she dropped the shawl, and it fluttered over the petals. Lillian bolted forward, scooping it up. "Miss Marple," she said, voice quavering, I saw this under the rose when I fetched my shawl. I thought it fluttered from the marquee." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "Thank you, Lillian." "Did you notice anyone else near here?" Lillian shook her head. "No one. I run far from crowds." Miss Marple patted her hand. "All right, dear." Then she watched Lillian flee to her grandmother at the vicarage steps. The girl's urgency spoke of genuine distress, not artful evasion. Turning back to Baker, Miss Marple said, "This note ties 2 actions, the brooch concealment and the murder itself, suggesting the same person orchestrated both theatrics. Whoever did this wanted to be noticed." Baker tucked the note into his notebook. "Let's catalog it as evidence. After that, I will question Mr. Giles about his tools." Miss Marple offered her arm. "Let us walk through the marquee once more. I have a feeling the true clue remains." Inside, they re-entered the marquee. The scent of crushed roses mingled with tea and damp canvas. In the center, the lampshade still hung, its fringe limp. Miss Marple ran her finger along the rim, finding a faint smudge of red wax. "A broken candle," she murmured. At the refreshments table, a silver candelabrum bore traces of melted red wax. One candle was missing. She pointed it out to Baker. "Our killer used a candle to weigh down the shade, then flicked the wax to mimic blood." Baker knelt beside the candelabrum. "Red wax matching this residue," Miss Marple smiled. "Fabricated blood to distract us. But note the missing candle. It should be among the remnants." They stepped aside as Constable Peters arrived with Mr. Giles, who stood rigid, eyes downcast. The inspector opened the toolbox. Inside lay chisels, hammers, and a small, slender awl, one end stained with red wax. Baker held it up. "Mr. Giles, would you care to explain how this came to be here?" Giles stammered. I left my tools here after fixing the trestle legs. I must have dropped it." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Mr. Giles, did you carry a candle with you?" A melted stub of wax was found on the lampshade rim and traces here on your awl. Giles swallowed. "No, ma'am. I wouldn't mix candles with carpentry." Baker exchanged a look with Miss Marple. "An awl is not a heavy weapon. Could it deliver the blow to Mr. Finch's temple?" Miss Marple considered. "Perhaps not the fatal blow, but it could have pried open the brooch pin. The weapon itself remains missing, but we know our culprit had both a blunt instrument and a tool for misdirection." The candelabrum caught her eye. She stepped forward, lifting the base slightly. Beneath it lay a slender iron bar, thin but solid, perfectly weighted for a single precise blow. Baker gasped. "The murder weapon?" Miss Marple nodded. "And note the wax dripped here to disguise its presence. The murderer intended the blood vial to draw attention, not the bar." Giles's face went ashen. I don't know how that got under there." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Someone hid it beneath the table display. The candlestick would have covered the bar entirely." Inspector Baker looked to Mr. Giles. "You said you repaired the table legs after sealing the area. You had both, the opportunity and the tools, and you were closest to the display before the blessing." Giles shook his head fiercely. "No, I swear I only touched the legs. I would never kill Mr. Finch." Miss Marple held up a gloved hand. "Let's not convict yet. We have uncovered the bar, the wax, the note, and the glove. But how does Mr. Giles fit into the personal motive that preceded these theatrics?" Giles stared at the bar. I... He broke off as a faint sob reached Miss Marple's ears. They turned to see Mrs. Pemberton collapse against the Marquis's side, sobbing uncontrollably. Miss Marple moved to her. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Mrs. Pemberton gasped, clutching at her throat. "It's all gone wrong. Roland he discovered my secret and threatened to tell everyone." Her sobs were racked with genuine grief. "I only meant to scare him, throw the brooch at him, make him fear superstition, and then recover it quietly. I never intended murder." Silence fell. Miss Marple stepped back, considering the postmistress's confession against the evidence. A tattered scrap of remorse, an olive and burgundy scarf matching the threads, and a motive born of fear and blackmail. Inspector Baker closed his notebook. "Mrs. Pemberton, I'm afraid you must come with me." As constables approached to guide her away, Miss Marple lingered by the lampshade. She traced a final stitch on her invisible knitting. The hidden clue had been unearthed at last. That torn note under the rose, the misplaced glove, the candle wax, and the iron bar, each a step closer to unveiling a desperate act, born of secrets in St. Mary's Undercliff. And as the postmistress was led away, eyes darting with shame and fear, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The next step would be the psychological test, the moment when the real murderer's facade would crack, and the true nature of human folly and redemption would be laid bare. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Inspector Baker's Constables. Lead Mrs. Pemberton away, her gloves half torn, her scarf hanging askew. A hush settled over the marquee. The postmistress, once a pillar of village respectability, now trembled under the weight of her own admission. Miss Marple lingered by the rose-strewn path, her gaze on the retreating figure, then turned back to the crowd gathering in clusters. The fete, meant to celebrate summer warmth, now lay cloaked in the chill of suspicion. Miss Marple straightened her shawl and beckoned Inspector Baker close. "Inspector, it is time for a more focused inquiry. I believe the remaining secrets lie with those who have not yet fully revealed themselves." Baker nodded. "I agree. Whom do you wish to question next?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Mrs. Price, Colonel Mustard, and young Lillian Harrington. Together, in private. Let us observe their reactions under pressure." He arranged a small room in the vicarage with calf tables and chairs. Tea was poured, biscuits laid out, an air of domestic normality, intended to soothe. Yet each person's entrance was edged with tension. Mrs. Price arrived first, pale and composed, fingers twisting her brooch across her lap. Colonel Mustard followed, his uniform immaculate, but his gaze restless. Finally, Lillian Harrington entered. Clutching her green shawl, eyes wide yet resolute, Miss Marple motioned them into seats around the table. "Thank you all for coming," she began in gentle tones. "I know this has been a trying day, but to untangle the truth, I must ask you to share what you have not yet told Inspector Baker." Mrs. Price's voice shook. I thought Mrs. Pemberton was the murderer. She had motive blackmail, debts, fear of exposure. I hid my brooch under the lampshade, only to recover it later for the raffle. I swear I did not harm Roland Finch." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. Yet you shared with me just now that you found a scrap of paper under a rose bearing the words, 'Forgive me.' You seemed surprised, yet it matched neither your handwriting nor Mrs. Pemberton's known style." Mrs. Price's eyes darted to the window. "I found it after. The police brought her away. I kept it hidden. I thought it might help," she faltered. "But I don't know whose it is." Miss Marple fixed her gaze on Colonel Mustard. "Colonel, you witnessed a figure slip behind the hedge at the final amen. You then retraced your steps and found footprints. You admitted the prints were shallow tiptoed, as though avoiding detection." Colonel Mustard adjusted his cufflinks. "I did. I thought it out a woman, perhaps. I imagined Mrs. Pemberton or Mrs. Price's niece, Lillian, but neither matched the height or gait." Miss Marple turned to Lillian. The girl's knuckles were white around her shawl. "Lillian, you mentioned seeing someone in a green shawl among the apple trees when you fetched yours." Lillian's voice was soft but firm. "I did. I thought it my own scarf fluttering in the wind. But when I arrived, it lay on the rose bed with the apology note. I picked it up and hurried away." Miss Marple's gaze flickered between them. "Thank you. Now, Colonel, you said no weapon was visible, just a shapeless figure. Yet the fatal blow came from an iron bar hidden beneath the candelabrum." Colonel Mustard stiffened. "Yes, and only someone with access to the marquee before it was sealed could have placed it there. I was mending fences at the edge of the field." Miss Marple smiled gently. "So you say, Mrs. Price, you rose early to oversee the marquee's setup. Surely you would have seen an extra object under the table." Mrs. Price shook her head, tears brimming. "Nothing unusual until the inspector's men swept through." Miss Marple's voice soft. "I understand. but someone had to hide the bar and remove it afterward. Whoever found it would be aware of its weight and shape, just as Mr. Finch knew the lampshade's legend. Roland Finch, you see, held secrets. Of his own. Mrs. Price looked bewildered. What secrets? Miss Marple leaned forward. He discovered Mrs. Pemberton's stolen letters blackmail material only a day before. She feared exposure. But he also learned of someone else's secret. He held Colonel Mustard's letter of resignation from the army, which carried hints of disgrace. A ripple of shock passed through the colonel, who paled. Lillian gasped. Quietly Inspector Baker's brow furrowed. Miss Marple, do you suggest Colonel Mustard had motive? Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. He wished to keep his resignation hidden. Mr. Finch threatened to publish the letter in the local paper to serve public interest, he claimed. Colonel Mustard rose, voice harsh. Nonsense. I have served my country honorably. That man lied to me about the letter's origin, claimed it was forged. I went to confront him, but I did not kill him. Miss Marple gestured calmly. Tell us what happened when you found him. The colonel ran a hand through his hair. I found him by the lampshade just as the blessing ended. He held the letter in one hand and the brooch in the other. He sneered at me, said he would ruin my reputation. I lost my temper. I raised my cane, but before I could strike, he laughed. I turned away in anger, and then I heard a thud. Mrs. Price's hand flew to her mouth. So you saw the blow land? Colonel. Mustard nodded. Yes, but I did not see the murderer. I turned back to help, and he was already dead. Miss Marple folded her hands. Thank you. Your anger explains the cane's absence. It was hidden among your belongings, and later retrieved. But the fatal blow came from the iron bar, not your cane. A tense silence followed. Lillian sat trembling, clutching her shawl. Miss Marple addressed her next. Lillian, you and Mr. Finch were close. He tutored you. What was your last conversation? The girl's voice trembled. He told me to keep secrets close, but only truths can save a reputation. He didn't mean to blackmail. He intended to shield the colonel from greater scandal. Inspector Baker exchanged glances. Greater scandal? Lillian nodded. He discovered Colonel Mustard had gambled away regimental funds. He wanted to help the colonel make restitution, not ruin him. Mrs. Price gasped. Oh, heavens! Miss Marple's eyes shone with gentle authority. Roland Finch acted from goodwill, but his revelations frightened each of you. Fear of debts, of disgrace, of exposure. Each had motive, but only one had. The means and the nerve. She turned her gaze on Mrs. Price. Mrs. Price, you owed money to Mr. Finch for fencing debts, did you not? Mrs. Price shook her head vehemently. No, I paid him in full yesterday. Miss Marple lifted a delicate finger. Yet your accounts show a balance owed £7, tens. You secretly pressured him to inflate the debt so that you might claim hardship. At the fate, Mrs. Price's face crumpled. He threatened to reveal it unless I gave him the brooch to sell. I hid it under the lampshade to rescue it later, but when I found him, he demanded the watch as well. Miss Marple's soft smile was triumphant. You feared ruin in the newspapers, debts, mismanagement of charity funds, a scandalous seizure of Mrs. Price's heirloom. In desperation, you struck with the iron bar, pried open the brooch pin to distract the crowd, and shattered the vial. To simulate superstition, all the while framing others with threads, the apology note, and a dropped glove. Mrs. Price's tears fell freely. "It's true. I didn't mean to kill him, only silence him." Inspector Baker stood. "Mrs. Price, you are under arrest for the murder of Roland Finch." As constables led her away, Lillian burst into sobs. Colonel Mustard sank back into his chair, hollow with relief and grief. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "The heart of human nature is both fragile and fierce," she said quietly. "We seek to hide our flaws, yet it is those very flaws that speak most loudly." In St. Mary's under Cliff, a whispering lampshade revealed the quiet desperation and the truth. Behind it, she gathered her knitting bag. Inspector Baker offered his arm. Outside, the fading sunlight cast long shadows of the marquee and its inhabitants, each marked by the secrets they had carried and the terrible price of their concealment. Chapter 7. Another twist. The rattle of the police van's wheels faded down the lane, leaving Whisperwood Manor's lawns eerily silent. Inspector Baker handed Mrs. Price's confession statement to a constable, then turned to Miss Marple beneath the marquee's fringe. "Thank you, Miss Marple. With Mrs. Price in custody, I believe the case is closed." Miss Marple folded her, knitting into her bag, but her eyes did not rest on the departing constables. Instead, they settled on Mr. Finch's satchel, still propped against a trestle leg. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might we look inside the satchel once more?" Baker hesitated, glancing at the bag. "We've already catalogued its contents. Why revisit it?" "Because I believe we overlooked something," Miss Marple replied. She knelt, unfastened the satchel's flap, and peered within. The watch and notebook were gone, of course, but tucked among the papers lay a small sealed envelope, addressed in a precise feminine hand to E.P. Beneath the initials was the faintest crest of ivy. Baker took the envelope, eyebrows rising. "E.P. for Everly Price? But the postmistress's initials are A.E." Miss Marple shook her head. "E.P. is Eleanor Pemberton's maiden name, Eleanor Pemberton. She kept her family crest of ivy when she married. This envelope was hidden here deliberately after the satchel was emptied." The inspector's face darkened. He sliced open the seal. Inside lay a single sheet of parchment, a draft will in Mr. Finch's handwriting. It named Mrs. Pemberton sole beneficiary of Whisperwood Manor and Mrs. Price's estate, should she perish by misadventure. Good heavens! Baker breathed. He was planning to leave everything to her. Miss Marple nodded, or planning to blackmail her with it. In either case, Mrs. Pemberton had stronger motive than even Mrs. Price. Baker tapped the paper, but Mrs. Pemberton's scarf threads matched those in the marquee, and she confessed she handled the brooch. Yet she also claimed she meant only to frighten Mr. Finch, Miss Marple pointed out. Mrs. Price confessed to striking him in a panic over debts, but did she know of this will? Or did Mrs. Pemberton plant it here to implicate someone else? They rose and exited the marquee. The late sun burned orange across the hedges. Mrs. Pemberton's former composure returned as she emerged from the van, escorted back for further questioning. The draft will now lay between her and a fresh set of charges. Outside the marquee, Canon Harrington approached, his clerical collar askew. "Inspector, Miss Marple, there is a matter you should know." He held up a stained handkerchief. "I found this in the church porch when I went to pray for the deceased." Miss Marple recognized the delicate stitchwork at once. It was the glove recovered from the marquee, now soaked through with more than morning dew. Baker took it. But how did it get to the church? The canon looked grave. I prayed there after the commotion. I must have dropped it, but someone could have taken it from the marquee and dropped it here later. It suggests someone moved evidence to and from the church, Miss Marple mused. Not only planting threads and notes, but staging movement between two locations. That takes premeditation. Meaning, Baker said, another player lurks beyond Mrs. Price and Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Marple's eyes darted to Lillian Harrington, who stood beneath an apple tree, clutching her shawl. Tight. The girl's cheeks were stained with tears, yet she watched the proceedings with a haunted intensity. "Lillian," Miss Marple called gently. "May I speak with you?" The girl approached, voice hushed. "Yes, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple produced the draft will. "Have you ever seen this before?" Lillian's lips trembled. "No, but I recognized Mr. Finch's handwriting from my tutoring notes." She glanced at the ivy crest. "It belonged to my mother before she remarried. She told me Eleanor Pemberton was her best friend." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Then Mrs. Pemberton could easily forge this draft. Yet she claimed she only meant to scare him, never to kill. Someone else, then, might have used her motive to cover their own. Baker frowned. "You mean Mrs. Price was the fall guy?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But consider Colonel Mustard. His resignation letter, the missing cane, the footprints. He had urgent need to hide scandal, and he moved freely between church and marquee, both sides of evidence." Inspector Baker's gaze followed her silent indication. The path from the orchard hedge ran straight to the church gate, his footsteps matching the glove's trajectory. Miss Marple turned back to Lillian. "Did you see Colonel Mustard near the church after the blessing?" Lillian's eyes flickered. "Yes, I thought he went to ring the church bell in Thanksgiving. He returned just as the coffin was loaded." Baker's face paled. "You mean he had access to the church porch where the glove was found and to this site?" Miss Marple nodded. "He could have picked up the glove, planted it at the marquee, and retrieved it later to mislead the investigation. Then he staged the draft will to implicate Mrs. Pemberton." A sudden cry rang out. Mrs. Pemberton, confronted again by constables, had fainted in the church doorway. The inspector turned, torn by conflicting evidence. Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. "Inspector, our next step is clear. Colonel Mustard must explain his movements at both locations, and the glove and draft must be matched to his belongings. Only then will the true architect of the crime be laid bare." Baker squared his shoulders. "Very well. Thank you, Miss Marple. Again, you've shown us there is always another twist." As the gathering clouds moved across the sunlit village, Miss Marple surveyed the faces around her. In the whispering lampshade's glow, the guilty and the innocent alike trembled, and the final act of deception had only just begun. The village fate had yielded one confession, but another murderer still walked among them, hidden by layers of misdirection. And Miss Marple, steely yet gentle, was determined to peel back each layer until the truth emerged. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final testa. Soft hush fell over Whisperwood Manor's orangery as dusk approached. The string quartet summoned back. Despite the day's horrors, played a tentative waltz beneath the glass roof. Miss Marple stood by a small round table, set with tea and biscuits, her knitting bag at her feet. Inspector Baker had agreed to her suggestion to observe the remaining suspects under the guise of resuming the fate's hospitality. Seated around the table were Colonel Mustard, rigid in his former uniform, and Mrs. Pemberton, pale from her recent confessions and medical attention. Lillian Harrington hovered behind them, clutching her green shawl. A low murmur ran through the gathered villagers' curiosity, tempered by unease. Miss Marple tapped the table gently. "Thank you all for returning. I thought a comfortable setting might ease tensions as we review certain points." She poured tea with careful precision. "Colonel, Mrs. Pemberton, you've both been extraordinarily cooperative, given the gravity of events. Yet questions remain." She set a small silver tray between them, upon which rested 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing a single initial, CM, EP, and GM. "A small exercise," Miss Marple continued, "to test our memories. Inside each envelope is a statement purportedly made by one of you at the fete earlier today. I ask that you read them aloud if you will." Colonel Mustard exchanged a tense glance with Mrs. Pemberton. Lillian stepped forward to distribute the envelopes. Colonel Mustard took C1 and broke the seal with steady fingers. Mrs. Pemberton and Miss Marple held their breath as he unfolded the paper. He cleared his throat. "I saw a shadow slip behind the hedge at the final amen, but could not identify it." Colonel Mustard's brow furrowed. "Yes, that is my statement." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite, Mrs. Pemberton, please." Mrs. Pemberton inhaled and opened EP. Her voice trembled as she read, "I intended only to frighten Roland Finch by using the brooch and superstition, but I never meant harm beyond that." She folded the paper, eyes damp. "Yes, those were my words." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And this one," she said, handing JM to Colonel Mustard, "is a paraphrase of my own observation. The threads red and green could belong to anyone wearing burgundy and olive." Colonel Mustard read aloud, "Threads red and green could belong to anyone wearing such hues, but may also point to deliberate misdirection." He nodded. "Precisely." Miss Marple tapped each envelope. "Thank you. Now, would you please place them back on the tray?" As the 2 suspects complied, a faint rustle sounded at the far end of the orangery. Lillian's shawl swept the edge of a small side table, sending a silver candlestick clattering to the floor. The quartet faltered. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How curious," she said, rising. She retrieved the candlestick and held it up to the lantern light. "You may recall this piece once part of the marquee display." She turned it over and revealed a fresh smudge of red wax. Colonel Mustard's jaw tightened. Mrs. Pemberton gave a startled gasp. Miss Marple replaced the candlestick on the tray and resumed her seat. "Earlier, I suggested the wax came from a melted candle used by our culprit," she said. "I now present the very object, but observe the wax here is still warm, still pliable." She tapped it gently. A small glob shifted. The suspects exchanged glances. Mrs. Pemberton's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her envelope. Colonel Mustard's breathing became audible in the silence. Miss Marple unfolded the tray's cloth to reveal a 4th envelope tucked beneath. Its label bore only the Whispering Lampshade's crest. She passed it to Lillian. "Would you read?" "This for us, dear." Lillian, pale but steady, opened it. "I know what you did, and I forgive you if you confess." Meet me by the church at sunset. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Mrs. Pemberton clapped a gloved hand to her mouth. Colonel Mustard's face paled further. Lillian's eyes welled with tears. Miss Marple folded her hands. This envelope was not among the evidence collected, yet it appeared on my tray just minutes ago. It could only have been placed there by someone in this room. Inspector Baker stepped forward. Miss Marple, what are you implying? She fixed her gaze first on Mrs. Pemberton. You, Mrs. Pemberton, have claimed melodramatic motives, but when I offered you safety, you could have planted confusion rather than seek forgiveness. Mrs. Pemberton shook her head. I would never. Miss Marple turned to Colonel Mustard. Or you, Colonel. You wished to draw Mrs. Pemberton or Mrs. Price back to the church porch where the glove lay. This letter could provoke such a meeting. Colonel Mustard's jaw twitched. I had no reason to meet anyone at the church after sunset. Miss Marple's calm voice carried. Yet you did. Lillian saw you pass the porch on your way here. You claimed to inspect a loose bell rope, but no rope was loose. A murmur rippled through the villagers. Colonel Mustard swallowed. I wanted to retrieve my cane, he stammered. I dropped it earlier in the orchard. Miss Marple inclined her head. Retrieve it, so you might use it without suspicion. But the cane was never the murder weapon. She stood, drawing a final stitch with imaginary knitting. One of. You placed this demand for confession under the guise of a meeting. Neither Mrs. Pemberton nor Colonel Mustard truly sought forgiveness, only concealment or accusation. She approached Mrs. Pemberton, voice soft. Eleanor, did you write this letter to entrap Colonel Mustard? Mrs. Pemberton shook her head fiercely. No, I wrote it to catch him. Yes, but not to harm him. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle, but firm, and yet you risked more confusion. You acted from fear. Then she turned to Colonel Mustard. Colonel, did you plant this letter to draw Mrs. Pemberton into the open so you might retrieve evidence from the church porch unseen? Colonel Mustard's shoulders slumped. It was I, he whispered. I feared Mrs. Pemberton's influence. Her secrets could destroy me. I wrote the note, hoping she would return to the church. There I intended to recover my glove and, if possible, the will. But when I learned she had fainted, he trailed off, anguish in his voice. Mrs. Pemberton covered her face. Inspector Baker stepped forward, resolute. Colonel Mustard, I'm afraid you will accompany us for further questioning. Miss Marple held up a hand. Not yet, Inspector. There remains one final observation. She retrieved the unopened J-Mun envelope. Earlier I asked you to recall my statement, but notice its seal is intact, yet it was among those we opened. She broke the seal and read. The threads red and green proved deliberate, misdirection by someone well acquainted with both Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Price. She handed the paper to Baker. Mrs. Price had no knowledge of Colonel Mustard's attire. Only you could craft such a precise clue. Colonel Mustard's face drained of color. I used the threads to frame her to salvage my honor. I never meant violence. Miss Marple nodded. Yet violence was already done. Your note led Mrs. Pemberton away, delaying her alibi. The resultant confusion allowed you to retrieve the final evidence unobserved and nearly escape suspicion entirely. A hush enveloped the orangery. Inspector Baker closed his notebook. Colonel Mustard, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Roland Finch. As constables moved in, Colonel Mustard slumped in defeat. Mrs. Pemberton wept softly. Lillian rushed to her side, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, knitting needles finally still. "Thank you," Baker said quietly. "Your test was brilliant." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Only a gentle test," she replied. "Human. Nature reveals itself when least expected, and the quietest among us often carry the heaviest secrets." Outside, night fell over St. Mary's Undercliff. The Lampshade's legend faded into memory, but its whisper had borne witness to human frailty, and to Miss Marple's unerring skill in unveiling the truth. 9. The Reveal the Orangeries. Lanterns cast warm pools of light across the polished stone floor, illuminating the small cluster of villagers who had lingered to witness the denouement. Inspector Baker stood among them, notebook in hand, while Miss Marple remained seated at the tea table, her knitting bag closed at her side. Colonel Mustard, hands clasped behind his back, stared at the ground, and Mrs. Pemberton sank into a chair, pale but silent. Lillian Harrington hovered nearby, eyes wide with anxiety. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and cleared her throat softly. "Thank you all for remaining. Before we conclude, I should explain how each clue fits together to expose the true culprit and the sequence of events that led to poor Roland Finch's death." She paused, meeting each face in turn. "Let us begin with the brooch and the superstition. Mrs. Price intended to hide her heirloom beneath the lampshade so that she could reclaim it for the charity raffle. She believed Mr. Finch, whom she feared might expose her financial imbalance, would attempt to confiscate it, so she sought to protect it temporarily." Mrs. Price's gaze wavered unsteadily. She tightened her gloved fingers but remained silent. Miss Marple continued. "Roland Finch, a man of gentle character but unyielding principles, discovered both Mrs. Price's unpaid debt and Colonel Mustard's resignation letter detailing his disgrace. He believed in restoring Colonel Mustard's reputation by having him make restitution, yet he also held Mrs. Price to account for her debts. Thus he confronted each privately. Inspector Baker glanced at Colonel Mustard, whose shoulders jerked ever so slightly. Miss Marple nodded toward the Colonel. "Colonel Mustard, you confronted Mr. Finch near the marquee just after the vicar's blessing. You raised your cane in anger, but you did not deliver the fatal blow. Instead, you retreated to collect your cane dropped earlier in the orchard and to plant evidence that would misdirect suspicion onto Mrs. Pemberton." Colonel Mustard's head lifted. I feared disgrace. I meant only to scare him to reclaim the letter he held. I did not kill him." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Pemberton. "Eleanor, you indeed intended to frighten Mr. Finch with the brooch and superstition. The threads, red and green, came from your burgundy and olive scarf, explaining their presence on the lampshade. You shattered the vial for theatrics, but you recoiled in genuine shock at the violence that followed." Mrs. Pemberton bowed her head. Her shoulders shook with restrained sobs. Miss Marple tapped the table once. "None of you, however, possessed the opportunity and combination of motives to arrange the scene entirely. That distinction belongs to the real murderer, who exploited each of your actions." All eyes turned to Lillian, who backed a fraction. As though uncertain of her role, Miss Marple offered her a reassuring smile. "Lillian, you were an unwitting witness. You retrieved your green shawl from the rose bed and saw Colonel Mustard slip behind the hedge. You did not intend to lie. You only misremembered the colors in your distress. But you also discovered the scrap of paper bearing, "Forgive me. That note was your mother's handwriting. Not Mrs. Price's intended to draw your grandmother, Mrs. Pemberton, back to the church." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. I thought it was meant for me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed." But the note's true author was Mrs. Pemberton Eleanor, hoping to prompt Colonel Mustard's return to the church porch, where she believed he would be vulnerable. Yet he anticipated her plan and retrieved the confession letter himself, creating a final twist. Inspector Baker stepped forward. "Miss Marple, forgive my interruption, but it seems we still lack clarity on the fatal blow." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. "Ah, yes, the iron bar hidden beneath the candelabrum. That weapon belonged to Colonel Mustard's garden shed, a thin iron pruning bar. He concealed it under the display before the blessing, intending to use it only if Finch resisted. When Colonel Mustard raised his cane and Finch recoiled, the bar slipped free of its hiding place. In the confusion, he picked it up and, in a moment of panic, struck Finch once at the temple. Colonel Mustard shuddered. "It was an accident. I meant only to frighten him." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but in the fraught tension of discovery, the blow was delivered with sufficient force to be fatal. "You then used your all found in Mr. Giles's toolbox after you borrowed it clandestinely to bend the brooch pin and plant wax traces, creating a smokescreen of superstition." Inspector Baker's pen moved briskly. "And the glove found beneath the marquee then at the church porch?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled. "You planted it first to frame Mrs. Pemberton, knowing her passion for order. Later you retrieved it from the porch when you realized suspicion might circle back to you. The glove's journey mirrored your attempts to redirect blame." She paused and folded her hands. "Thus each of us played a part in this drama." Mrs. Price hid the brooch. Eleanor Pemberton planted the note and handled the brooch. Colonel Mustard delivered the fatal blow and orchestrated the misdirection, and poor Roland Finch fell victim to his own sense of justice. A hush settled as the villagers absorbed the revelation. Mrs. Pemberton wept quietly. Colonel Mustard's face burned with shame, and Mrs. Price closed her eyes, relief and regret mingling in her expression. Inspector Baker closed his notebook and advanced on Colonel Mustard. "Colonel, I will need your formal statement." He turned to Mrs. Pemberton. "Eleanor, you will accompany us as a witness." He gestured to two constables, who stepped forward. Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting bag. "Thank you all for your patience. May I suggest you now return indoors? The evening chill is setting in, and this day has been one of great sorrow." As the villagers slowly dispersed, Lillian hurried to Miss Marple's side. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have saved my grandmother." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Truth has a way of prevailing, dear, and remembrance of human kindness, even in dire moments, is what truly honors the memory of the one we have lost." Lillian nodded, tears on her cheeks, and joined her grandmother and the returning constables. Miss Marple watched them go, her expression serene. Inspector Baker approached. "You have once again shown remarkable insight, Miss Marple. I shall see justice done." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Only gentle justice, Inspector. It is our duty to remember that every action springs from human frailty." She lifted her knitting bag and, knitting needles at rest, followed the inspector and the two women toward the candlelit manor. Behind them, the whispering lampshade stood silent, its secret fulfilled at last. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The dawn after the midsummer fete found St. Mary's Undercliff bathed in a gentle mist, the dew-laden grass sparkling like a host of tiny candles. Whisperwood Manor stood silent, its gardens resting beneath the pale light as villagers gathered in subdued clusters along the gravel drive. News of Colonel Mustard's arrest and Mrs. Pemberton's exoneration, or at least her role limited to conspiracy rather than murder, had spread quickly. Now, at 10 o'clock sharp, the vicar's nephew, the new curate, prepared to lead a brief service of remembrance in the orchard where Roland Finch had fallen. Miss Jane Marple arrived first, her hat pinned with a single crimson rose. She stepped lightly through the apple trees, where the ground still bore the faint impressions of yesterday's tumult. Beneath the espaliered branches, she found Lillian Harrington placing a small posy of garden roses at the base of the spot, marked by a simple wooden cross. The girl's grief had tempered into quiet resolve. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple whispered, resting a hand on Lillian's shoulder. "He was a good teacher, and he deserves our respect." Lillian nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "He saved my reputation, too, with his kindness. I hope he finds peace now." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "He shall, and his memory will live on in every lesson you teach." As the service began, villagers arrived, Mrs. Price among them. Subdued and repentant, her charity raffle proceeds still intact, but her spirit marked by shame. She knelt beside her rose posy, murmuring a prayer through trembling lips. Colonel Mustard was conspicuously absent, escorted to the county jail under guard, awaiting trial. Mrs. Pemberton stood apart, supported by Lillian and Canon Harrington, her pale face lined with both relief and sorrow. The curate spoke of justice, tempered by mercy, and of life's fragility, his voice soft against the morning's hush. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in front of her, knitting bag at her feet. When the final hymn concluded, she stepped forward. "May I say a word?" she asked, and the congregation turned. Her voice was calm, yet carried the authority of one who had seen beneath many facades. "We have witnessed a tragedy born of fear and misunderstanding. Mr. Finch sought to right wrongs with zeal. It was that very zeal which led to his undoing. Yet he also reminded us that truth must be pursued with compassion. Let us honor him by ensuring that our own actions are guided by both justice and kindness." A respectful silence followed as villagers bowed their heads. Then Canon Harrington raised his hand. "Let us pray." After the service, Miss Marple walked back toward the manor's terrace, where tea and biscuits awaited those who remained. The string quartet had returned, for a softer, more contemplative set, their music drifting over the hedges. Hats were doffed, gloves removed. The air carried both relief and the lingering ache of recent events. Mrs. Price approached Miss Marple, her voice low. "Thank you for your guidance, Miss Marple. I shall devote the remaining raffle funds to the school Mr. Finch loved so dearly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A fitting tribute. And remember, Mrs. Price, honesty need never be as heavy a burden as the debt of silence." Mrs. Price managed a small, grateful smile. Across the lawn, Mrs. Pemberton and Lillian lingered. The postmistress turned, offering Miss Marple a gentle embrace. "I owe you my life and my granddaughter's future." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Only a reminder of the strength in forgiveness, Eleanor, and of the danger in secret fears." Lillian stepped forward. "Miss Marple, might you visit our school sometime? The children would so enjoy hearing of your detective work." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I should like that very much. After all, curiosity is the best teacher of them all." As the sun climbed higher, villagers drifted homeward. The marquee was taken down, the ropes coiled, and the lanterns stowed away. Only the whispering lampshade remained wrapped in protective cloth and destined for careful storage rather than public display. Its legend, once a piece of harmless folklore, would now remind Whisperwood Manor of the fine line between superstition and genuine peril. Inspector Baker arrived beside Miss Marple at the terrace. His usually stern features were softened by satisfaction. "Miss Marple, you have once more guided us to the heart of human motives." She smiled serenely. "Thank you, Inspector, and thank you for your willingness to follow." Gentle reasoning. He offered his arm. "Shall we join the others for tea?" Miss Marple looped her arm through his. "Indeed. There is nothing like a cup of tea to soothe both mind and heart." Together they walked toward the long teak table, where fresh scones and pink-iced buns awaited. Laughter and quiet conversation rose among the villagers, the tension of yesterday melting away in the warmth of community. Lillian greeted them with another posy, this one meant to decorate the teapot. Miss Marple settled into a wicker chair, knitting bag at her side as Mrs. Price poured the tea. Beyond the roses and apple blossoms, the village of St. Mary's under Cliff returned to its peaceful routine, forever changed by the tragedy and its resolution. And in the soft chime of teacups, Miss Marple reflected that even the darkest human secrets could be brought to light by patience, observation, and a sincere belief in the goodness underlying our frailties. Thus ended the mystery of the whispering lampshade, not with fanfare, but with the gentle restoration of order and the enduring truth that compassion and justice walk hand in hand.